Now is when we need to look a little more close. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Look a little more closely at acceptances and how it works. That's what I wanted to do. Thank you. All right, so acceptance is when the offeree effectively agrees to the offeror's offer. Effectively meaning EFF, effectively, that it has the legal consequences of being acceptance, of creating that contract. Yeah, there we go. That manifestation of assent, because we've dealt with some definitions already this semester, that manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer. Now, acceptance must be voluntary. If acceptance is done under duress, most courts will not enforce, I'm not even going to say most, courts will not enforce acceptance that is done under duress if it's done by fraud. That will cause courts to determine that acceptance was not truly voluntary. Sometimes you'll see the phrase entered in by free will, or something to that effect. The idea that the offeree chose to enter into this contract to accept these terms. That doesn't mean that the offeree has to be thrilled, okay? That the offeree is jumping up and down saying, ooh, yay, look at the terms that I get to this contract, okay? Because I'm sure you've all had the experience where you've entered into a transaction where you're not really crazy about having to do it, okay? Whatever that may be. Let's say, for instance, gas prices are starting to creep up again, okay? At least many of the prices that I have seen. So it's been down at $2.39, $2.49, $2.59 for a while. But what am I seeing now? $2.79, $2.89. Went up to Indiana not too long ago, and they had gases up above $3 a gallon. So, when you pull into a gas station and you enter into that transaction because you are entering into a contract, they promise to give you the gas, you promise to pay for the gas at the stated price. You may not be really happy about having to pay a particular price, but that doesn't mean you haven't done it voluntarily. You may not have done it being really thrilled and happy, but if that's the market price, or if that's the price where you're at, that is still a voluntary choice that you entered into. It must be done with intent. There must be an intent to enter into the contract, okay? Whether or not parties have entered into the contract with intent, whether or not they have done so freely and willingly and deliberately, will typically be evaluated by an objective standard. Objectively speaking, what would a reasonable person have intended by the behavior that that person engaged in, by the communication that that person engaged in, or that entity. Now, again, it does get, you have to be a little careful here and look at what the parties do and how they've done it. If the parties if the parties are having a conversation and they do not intend for their communication to create a contract, it will not, okay? Let's say, for instance, that Lakiantia comes to class and she, I'm sorry? Okay, let's say. Okay, look, yeah, what kind of dog is it again? Lab pit. Okay, so she's got, how old is it? Still chewing on everything then. Okay, but your kids love the dog, don't they? Okay, so Lekianta comes into class and she's complaining about this 1-year-old dog because, particularly being a lab with a pit mix, it's going to be chewing on everything, it's going to be into everything, it's going to have a lot of energy, it's going to be jumping all over the place because it just wants to play all the time. Okay? And who's got to pick up after the dog all the time? Who's got to make sure there's food for the dog to eat? Who's got to make sure that the dog gets out and gets exercise? Lekianta's got to do all of that, okay? Oh, and she comes to class and she's whining and complaining about this dog because she's just really ready for the dog to be older, to have calmed down, to stop chewing on everything. She knows her kids love the dog. But you know, one of those statements comes out of her mouth like, I'd sell that dog for $10 to anybody who wants it, okay? Now be careful, because I might run up to get my billfold. Because I don't have a dog right now, so no. But, okay, so, oh, now if you were trying to sell it, it'd be gone by now. Yeah, yeah. So, but let's, exactly. Suppose that Katie is hearing this conversation, and Katie loves dogs. See, do you have a dog right now? And I bet your 2 would really love a third playmate, right?
You're so funny.
And so Katie says, "Oh man, you know, that sounds like a really fun dog. That would be a good addition to my household. I'll pay you that $10 for that dog." Okay. Now, Lekianta, she's not really serious. Okay. She's blowing off some steam. She's a little frustrated with the dog, but she's not going to get rid of it really because she knows it would devastate her kids to get rid of the dog and. You got to go with me here, okay? and Katie knows that Lekianta isn't really serious, and truth be told, Katie's not really serious either, because 2 dogs can make a pretty full household anyway. So they are talking as if, yeah, I'm going to sell you my dog, yeah, I'm going to buy your dog, but they're not really serious. Their intent is not to enter into a contract, okay? So no intent. No true offer, truly, no true acceptance, no contract, okay? That's intent. Now, suppose that Lekianta is serious. I mean, without question, can you come tonight after class? I'm willing to sell my dog. And Katie, with equal seriousness, I really do need another dog because I got 2 of them, but one's pretty old, one's pretty young. That young one, boy, sure does keep pestering the old one. The old one needs a break. Let me get 2 young ones in there. They can pester each other and leave the old one alone. So now they are both serious, but they also both say, okay, you know, look, I'm going to sell you my dog. You're going to buy my dog. But come on, this is a sale for a live animal. Didn't we see, you know, because I saw something on that Mark DeAngelis YouTube channel, something about statute of frauds. We got to put something in writing. I think this contract's got to be in writing. So I tell you what, Lekianta says, you know, those form books, let me go back to, I saw something in one of those form books about the sale of a live animal. I'll write it up so we can both sign it. And then we'll really have the contract next week, okay? Because they mistakenly believe that this is a contract that has to be in writing to be effective. They are wrong, but that's what they mistakenly believe. Guess what? They've got a contract as soon as they orally agree, okay? Even though they don't think they do, because they think it requires writing, it does not, okay? So when they reach their agreement, I'm going to sell you my dog, I'm going to buy your dog, their contract is now created, it is in place. There has been an offer, there has been effective acceptance. Okay? So even though the parties may not think that they have a contract, they may still have a contract. One last thing here about this idea with regard to intent and whether parties intend to have created a contract or not. In general, courts have, looked at whether or not there was intent. If there is a question about intent, if it's not clear, was it a serious intent to enter into a contract, courts look at business situations differently than social settings. So for instance, in a business setting, courts generally presume, and it is a presumption, it's a rebuttable presumption, but courts generally presume an intent to create a contract in a business setting. The presumption is exactly the opposite in a social setting. In a social setting, the presumption is that the parties do not intend to create a contract. So for instance, if a parent says to a child, I will pay you $20 every week if you take the trash out. Okay? In a business setting, of course, obviously very different, but in a business setting, if there is an offer, I'll pay you X number of dollars every week if you take the trash out, okay? The presumption is that is an offer to create a valid contract. Acceptance of that is an intent to enter into that contract. In a social setting, if you have the parent saying to a child, I'll pay you X amount of dollars if you take out the trash every week, when the child tries to say, I'm going to sue you for breach of contract, yeah, that's not going to work, okay? Because the presumption is that there is not the intent to enter into a contract.
Like that 30-year-old student there?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry. There we go. All right, so there is at least the possibility that there may be limits on who may accept an offer. Remember, the offeror is the master of the offer. Lycantia may extend her offer to Katie in the full belief that, Katie's got dogs, she understands about dogs, she's going to take care of dogs, so I know if I sell her my dog, it's going to be well taken care of. But if Darlene is listening in on this conversation, and Darlene says, I'll buy your dog for $10, okay? The same offer that Lycantia made to Katie, but let's say that Lycantia says, oh, I've heard Darlene talk about having dogs before. She leaves them outside all the time. They only get to come inside when there's bad weather outside. They don't get a lot of attention. That's not how I want my dog treated. My dog's a house dog. My dog's used to being with the family inside, sleeping on the bed with the kids. I do not want my dog sleeping out on the hard ground every night, maybe being confined to a kennel with the concrete floor all the time. Lycantia, again, master of the offer, is the offeror. Lycantia gets to decide who the offer is extended to. She may extend it to Katie, but not to Darlene. That's her choice. Okay? So that means then that only Katie can accept, that Darlene does not have the power to accept. Now again, you have that question of an option contract, and that may change the dynamics in terms of who gets to accept. But that goes back to option contracts and how they are dealt with and whether or not they are actually transferable. Oh, yeah. The offeree does have to have knowledge of the offer in order to accept. kind of sounds like a no-brainer, right? How can you accept without knowing what you're accepting? There is, let's see, on page 53 of your textbook, I don't think it requires an awful lot of time to look at it and consider it, but on page 53, problem 2-29, you've got David who sends a letter on March 1st to a cousin saying, I'll sell you my Mustang for $18,000. And this is snail mail, okay? So it's not an email. It doesn't get there the same day. It doesn't even get there the next day. It takes a couple days to get to the cousin. The day after David sends his offer to sell, the cousin, totally independently, without any knowledge of what David has done, the cousin sends, again, a snail mail letter saying, I will buy your Mustang for the exact same amount of money. They each receive the respective communications, but do they have a contract? They've got two offers. Each one has made an offer. Neither offer has been accepted because at the time that each made their offers, they didn't know what the other one was thinking and doing, okay? So in order to have acceptance, there has to be this idea of knowledge of the offer. That, of course, does bring about the question of unilateral contracts, because with bilateral contracts, promise for a promise, I promise you if you promise me, okay? But what about with unilateral contracts that requires performance to have acceptance, and not just the start of performance, but full performance? The traditional view, and I'm going to say the traditional view was that the offeree had to know about the offer before beginning performance. So if we go back to a unilateral contract that is that reward, okay? I have lost my purse. If you return it to me, I will pay you X amount of dollars. If somebody finds a purse and as a good Samaritan says, ooh, let me see if I can find some identification as to who lost this purse, not knowing that there is a reward, contacting the owner of the purse saying, hey, I found your purse, how can I get it back to you? We have not yet had full performance, but the offeree doesn't even yet know that there is even an offer for a contract, okay? The restatement view, and I'm not going to bother to pull up the section number because the section number for these purposes is not important, but the restatement view is for a unilateral contract, the offeree has to know before performance is completed. So performance may be begun without knowing about the offer. But in order to accept the offeree has to know before the performance is completed. So let's say, for instance, that I lost my purse. I put a reward sign up outside my office. I am contacted by somebody who says, I have found your purse, how can I get it to you? So we decide that this person is going to bring it to my office. I still haven't said anything about a reward. The person doesn't know there's a reward until they show up outside my office, and lo and behold, there's a flyer that says reward for my lost purse. And now the person who found my purse says, oh, I see there's a reward. Thank you very much. Here is your purse. I'd like my money now. Okay? And that's fine. That is learning of the offer before performance was completed. And that then is sufficient. So, and I said the traditional view was because generally courts will say no, they'll follow that restatement view. All right. We looked at the law song. We talked about the mirror image rule, the idea that the acceptance must exactly mirror the offers because the offeror is the master of the offer. there have been cases about this question of whether or not there was acceptance. I don't even want to get into that. Classical contract theory is very strict about the acceptance must exactly match the offer. The modern view allows for some discrepancies, some differences. And he mentioned in that law song about the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC does have its own way of dealing with this idea of the acceptance exactly matching the terms of the offer, because the UCC allows for some variations in that. We will deal with the Uniform Commercial Code, I believe, in Chapter 8. And so we'll look at that question of with the Uniform Commercial Code and when you have acceptance and when what the terms are when we get to Chapter 8, because it really is kind of its own animal with its own requirements. That's right, we won't deal with that either. All right. Common law rule, gotta have it. Modern rule allows, okay. Let's talk about, no, let's not. I don't want to deal with that. We've got other things to talk about. All right, so what I want to talk about here for a few minutes is if acceptance is effective. If the acceptance is effective. And once we've talked about if the acceptance is effective, then we'll look at when the acceptance is effective. So first, looking at a unilateral contract. What is acceptance of a unilateral contract? Completed performance. That is the acceptance, that is the way in which acceptance, that's what an offer for a unilateral contract is accepted with that performance. Typically, the offeror gets notice of the partial performance through what the offeror sees. For instance, there may be some communication. So I found your purse. I haven't returned it to you yet, but I found it and I found your information in the purse, and I need to communicate with you about how to complete performance by actually getting it to you. Okay? So there may be some communication in that regard. If, for instance, remember when we were looking at the Aunt Martha and Ellen situation earlier, Aunt Martha says, I will leave you Blackacre if you live with me for the remainder of my life. Well, what's got to happen? Ellen's got to move in and live with her. Okay? So Ellen's working on performing, and it's clear for Aunt Martha to see. So in many situations, notice that an offeree is working on performance is conveyed just through the way that performance occurs. There are some situations, however, when that may not necessarily be the case. My parents own this piece of land, and this is going to be a very rough drawing, as so many of mine are. So I have a nephew who lives in Indianapolis. My parents live in Franklin, and oops, I should put this over here because my parents own, that's not right, but it's close. My parents own a plot of land that's close to Seymour, okay? Couple acres, wooded lot. Suppose that my parents say to my nephew who lives up in Indianapolis, if you clean up this lot, clear away the brush, get rid of the dead wood, create a little fire bowl, and level the land around that fire bowl a little bit so people can gather around the fire bowl and have a nice fire. And if you do that, we will pay you $10,000, okay? An offer for a unilateral contract. If my nephew leaves his home in Indianapolis to travel down to Seymour to begin clearing this lot, my parents aren't going to see it. They're not there to see my nephew leave. They are not there to see my nephew arrive at the plot of land and to begin the work. Okay? So in that situation, what has to happen is that the offeree does have to provide some notice to the offeror. Now, it's not acceptance, because acceptance is performance. But in these situations where notice is not inherently provided to the offeror through the performance, there has to be some notice given so that my parents know my nephew's going down there, their grandson's going down there, and he's performing. He is working toward full acceptance of that contract. Because let's say, for instance, that the deal isn't, if you clean up the lot, we'll pay you $10,000. The deal is, if you clean up the lot, we'll transfer title to you. Okay? Well, suppose that my nephew never says anything to my parents. He just starts to go down there on his weekends. They haven't heard anything. They don't know anything. They haven't been by the lot to check to see what's going on down there. They get approached by a neighbor who says, I want to buy your lot. They sell it. They don't have any idea that my nephew has started performing based on the contract. And you know, that idea of an implied option contract, not going to provide him with that protection because he has not given my parents notice that he is working toward performance, he is working toward acceptance. Now, that's with unilateral contracts. With bilateral contracts, how is a bilateral contract accepted? What is the method? The promise, right? I am aware of your offer. I am aware of your willingness to enter into a promise on your end. I promise on my end. Pretty clear, typically. Pretty straightforward. That being said, the offer may expressly indicate the method of expressing that promise. If the offer says, except by personal delivery of a handwritten letter, if somebody calls up and says, I accept your offer and I promise, do we have effective acceptance? No, because the offer says that it has to be accepted by personal delivery of a handwritten letter. If it's personal delivery of a typewritten letter, again, acceptance is not effective. Depends upon what the terms of that offer are. If they set out how that acceptance must occur, then that is how it must occur. There are some occasions, and these are the exceptions, there are some occasions where silence may in fact work as acceptance. Generally, that's not the case generally. The offeree has to take active steps, do something, communicate something to accept that offer. but there are some exceptions where the court will recognize silence as accepted. One is when the offeror tenders either property or services, when the offeree provides property or services with the offer and the offeree exercises ownership over that property or those services. Give you an example. Got a friend of mine who has for years been engaged in selling wine. Did not realize how hard it is to sell wine. There's a lot that goes into it because it has to do with licensing, and different states have different regulations about it, and it's hard to kind of get a foot in the door of the wine industry, of the restaurant industry to sell wines. So suppose that he's got cases of his wine that he has made, and he's going around to restaurants in the area. And he is asking restaurants if they would be willing to sell his wine. Stops by a restaurant, the manager is not there, nobody's there who's able to give him an answer to the question. So he leaves a case. And the offer with the case is, if you do not return the wine, I take your refusal to return the wine, your lack of action to return the wine, as acceptance if you are selling it in your restaurant. So if the manager of the restaurant takes action that is in ownership of that case of wine, they offer it as their house wine to their patrons. So they're selling it, okay? Their silence, even though they have not said, yes, we accept your offer and we'll pay you the money for this case, by being silent, exercising ownership over that property, that is now effective assent. That is acceptance, effective acceptance. And they have now agreed to those terms, and they now have to pay for that wine. Another situation when silence will work as, where silence will work as effective is when the offeree has given the offeror reason to believe that silence is acceptance, okay? How many of you have ever bought a magazine in a convenience store, a pharmacy like Walgreens or a bookstore, something like that, okay? How many times when you open up that magazine have there been 2 or 3 little postcard-sized pieces of paper that fall out? And those postcard pieces of paper typically say something along the lines of, get 3 issues for free, get the next 2 months of issues for free, just fill out this card, okay? And what it also says on there is when you fill this card, sign it and send it in, you understand that you're going to get your first however many issues free, and then unless you tell us to stop, we're going to continue to send you issues, but we're going to start charging you for them at that point. Okay? That's the way those deals will work. And you'll see them, get so many weeks, get so many months, get so many issues for free. Not episodes, but issues for free. But the idea then is you have to take action to stop receiving those magazines, to not have to pay. If you do nothing, your silence is acceptance to whatever terms, now you've got to pay however much money to get a year's worth of this particular magazine. So in that situation, you as the offeree have given the offeror reason to believe that silence is acceptance. Third situation I'll mention where silence is accepted is acceptance is when the offeror and the offeree have an established course of business. They have entered into a transaction several times before. It's, on the same terms, the same items are being supplied, typically the same price is being charged. And okay, no, we haven't really talked about it for this month or this year, whatever it is, but we've been doing it for the last 2 years, the last 5 years, so we're just going to continue to do it, okay? And no, they didn't put in an order, but I know that's what they need, so here you go, here are your items, okay? If there is that established course of business between the parties, then again, silence is effective as acceptance. One of the parties has to step up and say, time out, I don't want to do this anymore, okay? Don't send me anymore, I'm not buying anymore, or I'm not selling anymore, whatever the case may be, okay? But that particular hypothetical is only when you have that established course of business. All right. The offeree has to provide notice through whatever means are established by the offeror. Are these? No. Are these? And it depends upon what the offeror requires for the notification of the acceptance. If, let's say, for instance, a restaurant promises to pay an advertising agency $50,000 for the agency's promise to plan and execute a 3-month ad campaign. The agency calls the restaurant and promises. Do we have effective acceptance? Promise for a promise, right? We have a promise that is required. The restaurant is promising for the agency's promise. The agency calls and promises. Okay, so, so we have effective acceptance along the terms of what the restaurant required, what the offeror required. What if the restaurant promises to pay the advertising agency $50,000 for the agency's promise to plan and execute a 3-month ad campaign? The agency begins planning the ad campaign. No to what? No acceptance. What is required in order to accept? The promise. Has there been a promise? No promise, so no acceptance. What if the restaurant, and again, this is our question again, the restaurant promises to pay the advertising agency for the agency's planning and executing the 3-month ad campaign, the agency calls to accept the offer. Has there been effective acceptance? What type of contract is this an offer for? For a unilateral contract. What does it take to accept? Performance. Has the agency performed? No. So in this situation, there is no effective acceptance because acceptance is only through performance, and that's not what has happened. This time, the restaurant promises to pay the agency $50,000 for the agency's planning and executing the 3-month ad campaign. The agency begins planning the ad campaign. Has there been acceptance? But the option contract, remember, is its own contract. It takes away the offeror's power to revoke. So even if we have an implied option contract, do we have acceptance by the ad agency? What does it take to have acceptance? The planning and executing of the 3-month ad campaign, full performance. Now, yeah, based on what we were looking at earlier, we have an offer for a unilateral contract. Acceptance is through the planning and executing the 3-month ad campaign. The agency may have the protection of an implied option contract so the restaurant cannot revoke at 2 months and 28 days, but that doesn't mean we have acceptance yet. We don't have acceptance yet until the fully completed planning and executing of the 3-month ad campaign. Okay, so no acceptance yet. This time, the restaurant promises to pay the advertising agency $50,000 for the agency's promise to plan and execute a 3-month ad campaign. The offer allowed acceptance by notice to the restaurant or beginning the campaign. The next communication, the next information that the restaurant had was by seeing an ad on TV by the agency. Has there been acceptance? The offer said, we will interpret either notice to us or beginning the campaign as your promise. This is an offer for a bilateral contract, a promise for a promise. But it is also an unusual offer in that it allows the promise to be expressed by starting the ad campaign. Yeah, so in this situation, there is effective acceptance. And even though the restaurant didn't know it until sometime later when a representative from the restaurant saw the ad on TV, okay, well, now we know that we have a contract, but yeah, there is now a valid contract in place. But the offer allowed for acceptance through either notice or running the ad campaign. So it depends. Remember, again, the offeror is the master of the offer. So the offer can set out however that acceptance is communicated to the offeror. Okay? All right, so that's a little bit about whether or not you have effective acceptance. Let's talk about when that acceptance is effective, because that is also important. Just as the offeror has the right to set out terms in the offer about how acceptance may be communicated, how acceptance may occur, the offeror also has the right to designate when acceptance may become effective. Now, the general rule, sorry, I want to make sure I stay in sync here. Okay. The general rule is that acceptance becomes effective when it is manifested to the offeror in whatever way the offeror requires. So if you have parties communicating face-to-face, even if you have them communicating via email, via text, it's pretty easy to see, okay, so that acceptance is expressed through this email. That's when it becomes effective because it's been manifested to the offeror. Wasn't always so clear. And it's not always that clear because the methods of communication are not always so synchronous, so immediate. So you have what is referred to as the mailbox rule. And again, as I mentioned earlier tonight, this is one of those rules that developed when our methods of communication were very different. But courts still look to the mailbox rule and apply it with the communications that we have in current times. So while it may sound old-fashioned and like something that would never be an issue, that's not actually the case. It is still a valid, very relevant rule for looking at acceptance and when it becomes effective. The mailbox rule says that acceptance is effective at the moment it is properly dispatched, when it is sent. The restatement follows this mailbox rule and says that unless the offer states otherwise, the acceptance is effective when it is out of the offeree's possession. So the offeree says, I am sending my acceptance, I am sending it in the direction of the offeror, it's out of my possession now, so it is now effective. Let's talk about some ways in which this mailbox rule works in application. Go through some hypotheticals. So on May 25th, the seller sends an offer. June 1st, the buyer receives the offer. Anymore. On June 5th, the buyer sends an attempted acceptance, hoping to accept. June 6th, the seller, sorry, let me check something here. Yep, okay. On June 6th, the seller sends an attempted revocation. On June 7th, the seller receives an attempted acceptance. On June 8th, the buyer receives the attempted revocation. Oh, man, a lot to work through, okay? So we've got an offer on the 25th of May, offer received on the 1st of June. Buyer sends the attempted acceptance, but we've got this attempt by the seller to revoke. Do we have effective acceptance?
Yes. The acceptance went out before the revocation.
When is a revocation effective? Revocation? Remember, revocation is effective when it is communicated, when it is received by the offeree. So the seller sends the attempted revocation on June 6th. When did the revocation become effective, to the extent that it could be? The revocation wouldn't become effective until the 8th. When is acceptance effective? When it is sent. So the acceptance was effective as of June 5th, which means no more right to revoke. And in this situation, the seller is attempting to revoke not knowing that there is already a contract in place. But that's the way these rules work. Okay? Let's look at another one. Seller sends the offer, buyer receives the offer. We again have the buyer sending an attempted acceptance on June 5th. The next day, the buyer sends an attempted rejection. Seller receives the attempted acceptance on the 7th, also receives the attempted rejection on the 8th. Poor seller. What is the seller to think? Do we have a rejection or acceptance? Acceptance. What about the rejection? When is rejection effective? when it is received, when it is communicated to the offeror. The rejection would not have become effective until June 8th, but the acceptance became effective when it was properly dispatched, when the offeree, the buyer, sent the attempted acceptance, which was on June 5th. So in this situation, even though the buyer had that buyer's remorse, crud, I wish I wouldn't have done that, it's too late. Can't go back now. You had entered into the contract the day before. Let's look at another hypothetical. Seller sends the offer, buyer receives the offer. Buyer sends attempted acceptance. The buyer sends attempted rejection. This time the seller receives the attempted rejection first and then receives the attempted acceptance. In this situation, even though the seller thinks that the offer has been rejected, the acceptance is effective as of June 5th. Now, I will say in these sorts of situations where the seller, the offeror, receives the rejection first, the courts will provide some degree of protection. Because let's say, for instance, that the seller receives the attempted rejection on the 7th, has no idea about the acceptance having been sent previously, so on the evening of June 7th, the seller sells the item to somebody else. Good faith, sale to somebody else, no idea about the acceptance, only sees the rejection at that time. Hey, I got to try and sell this to somebody. Thought I was going to sell it to this person, but nope, not going to do that. Let me try and sell it to somebody else. Okay? In those situations, courts will provide some protection from a buyer who jumps in and says, wait a minute, we had a contract as of June 5th. Poor seller, what did I know about that? Okay? That being said, I mean, the rule does say, mailbox rule says, this is when the acceptance was effective. But again, if the seller acts in good faith, the buyer had not made any other attempts to communicate and say, hey, wait, you know, I sent two things. This is what I meant. This is when I sent the acceptance. This is what I want to do. If the buyer didn't take those steps, the seller a lot of times will not be held to the terms of that contract. Now, again, it depends upon how the seller behaved, how the buyer behaved, but the courts will try and provide some protection there. All right, slightly different setup. Got the offer sent, the receipt of the offer. Buyer sends attempted rejection on June 5th, sends attempted acceptance on June 6th. Seller receives the attempted acceptance on the 7th. The attempted rejection on the 8th. Why do we still have acceptance?
Because acceptance was sent before rejection was received.
The rejection is not effective until it is received, and so therefore the acceptance is effective as of June 6th.
Now, had it been the other way around, like on the 7th, they received the rejection? Or well,
That was this one,
oh, okay, yeah.
receiving the rejection first, not knowing that the
Yeah.
offer was effectively accepted on the 5th. Okay. Two more of these. Seller sends the offer, buyer receives the offer. Buyer sends an attempted rejection on the 5th, an attempted acceptance on the 6th. Wait a minute. Isn't this what we just did? Did I? Ooh, nope. Now I'm confused.
I think that was my scenario that about, and then
where the seller receives the rejection first. Yeah, that's the one we just did. When the rejection is received before knowledge of the acceptance, there's still a contract, excuse me, effectively created, but courts will protect and not come down too harshly on the seller. All right, this is the last one. We have the seller sending the offer, buyer receiving the offer on June 10th. There is a 10-day option contract that the parties enter into on June 10th. Seller notifies the buyer of revocation on June 12th. Buyer sends attempted acceptance on June 17th. The seller receives the attempted acceptance.
Still acceptance. There's a 10-day option.
What's the effect of the revocation? Nothing. That communication of the revocation has no effect because it's during that time covered by the option contract. Revocation sent during an option contract by itself does not kill the offer. In fact, the seller cannot revoke during the time of the option contract. Okay? That's the whole purpose of the option contract, is to take away the power to revoke during that period of time. What if on the 10th, instead of the seller notifying of revocation, what if the seller received the buyer's rejection on June 10th?
Wouldn't matter, 'cause it's a 10-day option.
Same thing. That rejection would not have any impact because of the option contract. I have, where is it? Nope, not here. Nope. Yep. I prepared this, and if you would like, I'm happy to post this on the content page. It's kind of a summary of acceptance when it's effective, revocation, rejection when it's effective, and some issues that go along with that. So acceptance is effective when it's properly sent, unless you have an option contract. And I have not mentioned this previously. I apologize. I should have mentioned this earlier. When you have an option contract, acceptance is effective when it is received. Because of the option contract, the offeror is giving up the right to revoke the contract. But the offeror is also entitled to know about acceptance during the time of that option contract. The alternative here is also effective, acceptance is effective when it is sent unless the acceptance is sent through a medium other than that authorized in the offer. So again, the offer says acceptance must be communicated via by personal delivery of a handwritten letter, and you have acceptance sent through an email. That is not effective when it is sent. Acceptance is effective when it is received if the offeror allows that acceptance. If the offeror is willing to agree to whatever alternative method is used, that's up to the offeror. Because if the offeror says, nope, I said this, I want this, that is what is required. Revocation effective when received. We've talked about that. Rejection effective when received. So if the offeree sends acceptance after sending the rejection, again, rejection is not effective when it is received. The acceptance is received by the offeror before the rejection. The acceptance is effective. The acceptance beats out the rejection. If the offeree properly sends acceptance after sending the rejection, if the rejection is received before, I changed this last night when I was looking over it. Because classical contract theory says the acceptance is effective. The restatement says it's a counteroffer. I am going to add here per the restatement, because that is the restatement rule. We'll leave it like that, but I'll post this to the content page so you can have this as you are studying. Okay. Any questions about acceptances? All right. Let's go back here to I will check, and if not, I will post them. Okay. We were looking at one of the restatement sections earlier, and I pointed out that phrase that talked about the taking action in the interest of justice, okay, as justice so requires, or something along those lines. And I mentioned then, and I think I mentioned this before, there are times when contract law can be harsh, the results can be harsh. And so what courts have done is they have tried to find ways to reach what they feel are fair results. And so we have a variety of these equitable options, and what I mean by equitable options are situations in which there may not be a true offer that qualifies as an offer. But there was some language and it really kind of seemed like an offer, and somebody else took action because of what they, it seemed like an offer, and so somebody else did something, and okay, so we're not going to let that. We're not going to let somebody get away with somebody taking advantage. So, even though there wasn't an offer, we're going to act like there was, or we're going to impose obligations as if there were, or, we're going to require this. There are situations where, okay, maybe there really wasn't consideration, but we're going to act as if there were, because that is what's fair. I have identified these as equitable options because in lawsuits, when you talk about equitable remedies, those are remedies that aren't money, when somebody has to do something or not do something. In this sense, these are equitable options because they are actions that courts take as what is sometimes referred to as an action in equity, an action in fairness. And you'll see language says, what does justice require? What is necessary to avoid something that is referred to as unjust enrichment? There is a phrase that is used in these sorts of situations frequently, and that is promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel is also sometimes referred to as reliance, and the idea of promissory estoppel is it's used in a couple different ways, but the idea is that courts will take actions to prevent unjust, unfair results. You may sometimes see the phrase, someone will be promissorily estopped. meaning there may not have been a valid contract, there may not be something that meets all the essential elements that the law would otherwise require, but the court's going to do what they want to get to a result that they think is fair. There are different ways in which these equitable options, this idea of promissory estoppel and reliance, come up. And we see it a little bit here at the end of this chapter. We will also see it a little bit later on down the road. This idea of reliance can sometimes be used when there is no real consideration that has been included in what kind of sort of would otherwise seem to be an offer. Now, the restatement does set out, do I have that? Good. The restatement does set out these essential elements of reliance, of this idea of promissory estoppel. And according to the restatement, the first thing you have to have is a promise by a promisor. So it's a question of looking at words, looking at actions taken by the promisor. Can those words, can those actions be objectively interpreted to be a promise? This is, again, an objective evaluation. What would a reasonable person think that the actions and the words taken by the promisor, would a reasonable person have interpreted that to have been a promise? It is something that looks at this question from the promisee's perspective. It's coming from the promisor. The promisor is the one making the statements, engaging in the actions, but it's an evaluation of how that would be interpreted by the promisee. The second element is that the promisor should reasonably expect the promise to induce action or forbearance by that promise. Now again, this is evaluated with an objective standard, but now it is from the promisor's perspective. Would a reasonable person in the promisor's position, would a reasonable person have expected the statements that were made, the actions that were taken, to have caused the promisee to take some action or to not take action? The third essential element is that, in fact, the promise does cause the promisee to act or not act. This is now looking at cause and effect. Okay? We look at this from the promisee's perspective. Would a reasonable promisee have perceived a promise to have been made? We look at this from the promisor's perspective. Should a reasonable promisor have reasonably expected action or forbearance? Does that in fact occur? But again, it has to be because of this promise, these actions, these statements that were made. If the action or forbearance were done independent of the promise, this section of the restatement, this idea of reliance, promissory estoppel, is not going to protect any of the parties. This section of the restatement is not going to work as a replacement, as an alternative to consideration. There has to be that cause and effect. Because these statements were made, because this action was taken by the promisor, there was then the action or forbearance by the promisee. There is another part of this in this evaluation that courts will consider, and that is, was this action or forbearance reasonable? Was it justifiable in light of the promise, in light of the actions that were taken, the statements that were made? If, for instance, what was that hypothetical I was using? And let's say it doesn't rise to the level of really giving consideration, because we're talking about consideration now. But you remember that idea that, you know, if Jennifer shows up, everybody gets an A on the test, okay? Is that reasonable in light of the circumstances, okay? Nobody in here should think yes, okay? But that is a part of the evaluation, because if it's not reasonable, if the action that is taken by the promisee or the failure to act, the not acting by the promisee is not reasonable in light of the circumstances, again, this section is not going to be applicable, and promissory estoppel reliance will not act as a way to provide some alternative to enforcement, or to a consideration rather. The last essential element then here is only enforcement of the promise will avoid injustice. Again, we get back to that idea of this is something that courts have developed over time. That's how it got into the restatement, because it had been developed by courts. The idea that this is action that the court will take because it's fair. It's fair to do it this way. It is fair to require parties to engage in this sort of behavior, or to do these certain things. I don't really want to. I don't want to get into those cases. They do have a problem on page 59 of your textbook. You have Mary Lou, a high school student, valedictorian of her high school student, offered a full tuition scholarship at Utopia. She turned down other partial scholarships from many other colleges and universities, so she could accept the full scholarship from Utopia. Think about this. Do we have a real contract here? We need offer, acceptance, and consideration. What's the consideration that Mary Lou is giving in exchange for the scholarship? What does Utopia get out of that? They get her attendance at their college. Second week of classes, she is informed by the college that they're not going to give her the scholarship after all. If you try to argue this situation on straight contract terms, offer, acceptance, consideration, you can make an argument, okay, so yeah, she agreed to attend. That's it's not the strongest argument to make. And it would certainly rise up against some challenges. Okay, so now this is someone we have to house. This is someone we may have to feed. This is someone we have to now educate. What are we getting out of all of this? But in this sort of situation, the idea and the reason this problem is posed is to get you to consider these elements. If an argument under a strictly classical contractual approach is weak at the least, well, maybe we can turn to the restatement. Was there a promise by the promisor? First of all, who's the promisor? Utopia, okay? And again, this is now going to be evaluated from Mary Lou's perspective. Would a reasonable person in Mary Lou's position perceive there to have been a promise? Yeah, they're telling me they're going to give me full tuition. Promisor should reasonably expect the promise to induce action or forbearance by the promise. Now, this is evaluated from the perspective of the promisor, in this situation, Utopia. Should a college or university in Utopia's position reasonably expect their promise, we're going to give you this scholarship, to induce action or forbearance? Should they reasonably expect that Mary Lou is going to take action in response to this indication that they're going to give a scholarship, a full scholarship? Yeah, certainly. So we've got those first two elements. The third element, now the cause and effect. Does the promise induce the action or forbearance? That's why she picked Utopia. That's why she turned everybody else down. So we have that cause and effect. Was that a reasonable action on behalf of Mary Lou? Yeah, because nobody else was offering her as good a deal. Okay. Only enforcement of the promise will avoid injustice. Yeah. It would really be bad if colleges 2 weeks into a semester could just start saying to students, oh yeah, that scholarship you thought you were going to get, sorry, we're not going to give it to you. And by the way, if you haven't paid up by the end of the week, we're going to purge you from your classes and you're not going to be a student here anymore. Okay? I mean, that would not be just. That would not be fair. And so you have these elements from the restatement as a way to try and provide some basis for preventing that injustice. Classical contract theory, Mary Lou would be in trouble. Restatement, she can be protected. And that injustice can be avoided. Now, this idea of promissory estoppel reliance does not just work as an alternative to consideration. There are other situations in which it has been imposed. When the promisor has not made a legally sufficient offer. We talked about offers last week. We talked about ways in which statements may not actually rise to the level of a legally sufficient offer. Okay? And in this situation, this is dealt with, and they talk about this in your textbook, as a cause of action. The idea here being that an injured party can use this reliance as a basis for filing a lawsuit when the promisor didn't actually make a promise. Because if there's no promise, meaning there's no offer, there can never be a true contract. So there can't be a breach of contract action because there's no contract. Breaching what? There never was a contract. So again, as a way to avoid injustice, the idea is to use this idea of promissory estoppel, the reliance. Guess what? This is also based on the same section of the restatement, which means that it has the same elements. It has the same analysis, the same requirements. Even if what the promisor said may not have risen to the level of a legally sufficient offer, yeah, what kind of language was used, what actions were taken, should the person making those statements or the entity making those statements or taking those actions have reasonably expected the promise to induce action or forbearance? Does it in fact induce action or forbearance? Is there cause and effect? And is that effect reasonable in light of the circumstances? And again, is it only possible to avoid injustice by acting as if there had been a true promise made and enforcing it as such? One more, not reliance, but restitution. Restitution, we talked about reliance interest and restitution interest the first night, 2 weeks ago, as remedies that may be provided. This is also this idea of using restitution and a pursuit of restitution as a cause of action. Restitution interest, remember, is the interest that returns a party to the position before the party conferred a benefit, whenever that benefit was conferred. Restitution interest returns that party to the position they were in before that benefit was conferred. Now, with this, it's not something that's evaluated under Section 90 of the restatement. Slightly different because it is a restitution, not a reliance analysis. And the first thing is you have to have a benefit conferred. It only makes sense if the goal is let's return this party to the position the party was in before that party conferred a benefit. Well, there has to have been a benefit conferred. They have to have done something to help the other party in some way. And this is typically, not exclusively, but typically the promisee providing a benefit, not the promisor, typically. Second element to this idea of restitution as a cause of action when there has not been a legally sufficient promise is the retention of the benefit without compensation would be unjust. Again, getting back to that idea of what's fair, what is right. Now, there are some challenges here in trying to figure out sometimes what it means to take actions to remedy this that would be just. But the idea here is focusing on what is fair, what is just. And that's it. To have restitution as a cause of action only has these two elements. There was a benefit conferred. Allowing the party to keep the benefit without compensating the other party would not be fair. That's all it takes. In this particular situation, there are some different phrases that you may hear. Implied contract is one that you will hear. Let me write this so you can. It may be an implied contract. It may be implied in law. It may be referred to as a quasi-contract. It may be referred to as, did I mention implied? Yeah, implied contract. Sometimes it's referred to as a constructive contract. These are different phrases that courts will use, recognizing that there is no contract in law. The law, under that classical contract theory, does not recognize a contract. The courts have said, yeah, we're going to act as if there is one anyway. We're going to acknowledge that there's not a real contract. That's why we call it a quasi-contract. That's why we call it an implied contract, an implied at law contract. Because, well, there wasn't really one there. But again, requiring these parties to behave as if there was a contract is the only thing that prevents an injustice. And again, like I said, we'll see this idea of these equitable issues coming up in some later parts, some later steps to this process. But those are the ones that are relevant to the parts as far as we have gotten. Okay? Oh, sorry. No, that was it. Yeah, okay. All right. Any questions about that? All right. Then let's talk for just a couple minutes about the test next week. True, false, multiple choice, matching, short essay questions. We need to determine test first or test second. Okay, test first. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I believe that is a majority. So test first. You will have an hour and 45 minutes to complete the test. Think that should be sufficient. That will then, at least I shouldn't, yeah, that'll be sufficient. We'll then take a break, and we will then start covering chapter 3 after that break has ended. If you're done with the test in 20 minutes, good on you. I hope your answers are right. You then have however much time remains. You've got the rest of the hour and 45 minutes. Everybody else is going to be working on the test. We're working toward completing the test. But then we'll have to come back and talk about chapter 3. Okay? No notes, no books. Sorry. Any questions? Yes, and the intro as well. There's just a little bit of intro stuff that is in there as well, but that will be covered by the test as well. Okay, any other questions? Yes, it will be on the quizzes page of PAWS. Okay, yes?
How will we know that we did our
The offers, let me double check because I think, where is that? I have to check that. I should have your offers graded and returned to you. We will talk about it after the test. Because your acceptance assignment will be due 2 weeks from tonight. And as I mentioned, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out hard copies. I've thought about trying to do this other ways, but I think it's just easier, I think, if I print out hard copies of your offers. No corrections, no grading, just the basic offer. And I'm going to take out, like if you used your name instead of making up a name, that's fine, but I'll take that out. So there shouldn't be anything there that specifically identifies you to that offer. But then you will get another student's offer, and we'll talk about the acceptance assignment and what is required of the acceptance assignment, because you'll have to start with that offer and accept that offer. Okay? Any other questions? Have a good evening, and I will see you next week.